not really. Bobby gets a summer break, and so we will have ample room to spread out, but I'm glad you don't. You know, this is good. This is good. I don't feel like I'm having to yell at anybody except y'all. That's okay. Sometimes I feel like I'm in a cave. I don't know. I was just told to wear this, so we'll see. Huh? Okay, good. That's the goal. Okay, so we've been talking about discipleship, and we're looking at discipleship in the Gospels, and we're trying to look at how Jesus discipled people, the ones who chose to follow him. Why did they choose to follow him? And then what was he trying to teach them? And, you know, we started out by looking at, you know, preparation. You know, there was preparation involved, then beginnings, then momentum. Then there was clearly a mission and a message that we wanted to adhere to. And then I've sort of changed what I had planned. I wrote out this whole outline for, you know, this series of classes. And then when we got to the one about questions, it dawned on me, this is really important. And so I've changed my outline a good bit. And so far I'm really glad that I did, because as I have tried to look at questions that Jesus asked and the questions that people asked Jesus and how he responded to them, I've realized just how important the discipleship process is using questions. And y'all have been great about offering up some questions that you've asked that have worked for you, or ideas that you have about questions that you could ask that would get spiritual conversations going. And that's really good. We need to be thinking in those terms. But I want to try to help us, if I can, get even more skillful with the questions that we ask, because I'm trying to think strategically about this too. And it sounds like I'm plotting against the world when I say this kind of stuff, and I don't mean it that way at all. What I'm trying to say is Jesus used questions in a real effective way to help people understand what was going on. Because if you can get somebody engaged in a question and answer session, okay, you're getting them invested in it, if you understand what I mean by that. If you can get somebody to say an answer to a question that you already know the answer to, because let me ask you this, do you think Jesus knew the answer to the questions that he asked? Yes. Every time? Yes, I'm virtually certain. He did not need to get information from people, but what he needed to do was to try to get people to think. Okay, and also to get them engaged in the conversation, because he would ask them a question so that they're engaged with it. And I think that's really, really important. So I had a real interesting call this afternoon. Just in case you're wondering, does anybody ever pay attention to this online stuff? Yes, they actually do, because I had somebody who is not able to be here because she's a caregiver, and she called this afternoon to say that she had listened to all the classes. She also was commenting on, you know, the Sunday morning stuff as well. But she was saying she was listening to the class and she felt like she was getting a lot out of it. But she called to ask me a question about someone that she really wanted to disciple. Her mother has been sick for a long time, and she had a really bad episode just a few weeks ago. And so she was being carried in for a procedure to try to save her life. And she asked the doctor, would he pray for her? And, you know, I'm sure that's not the first time that that's happened. But his response was, no, I won't, because I'm an atheist. Wouldn't do any good. Okay. So her question to me was, how would you have responded to that? How would you have responded to that? Anybody want to offer up anything?
I wouldn't want to upset her before you.
Exactly. Exactly.
How does he know it would
An atheist.
That's a great question. And you're catching on. How do you know it wouldn't do any good? That would have been a great question to ask. Yes, ma'am.
An atheist has to have more faith than a Christian, that there's not a God.
Uh-huh.
Because there's too much evidence to prove that there is. So he has to dispute everything
Mm-hmm.
that we see around us
Yeah.
to prove that there's not one.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I've never been in a foxhole with people shooting at me, so I don't know what that's like. But I admire those who have, and I would think that would be the case. So, but yeah, those are great questions. What harm could it do? You know, maybe. But I really appreciated the fact, first of all, that she called to say, hey, you know, I'm getting something out of this class. This is really helpful to me, and so I'm thankful for that. But also, she's concerned about that doctor. And she said, I really want another chance to talk to him. So help me to know what to say to him. So that's a really good thing. I hope she gets that opportunity. One of the things I try to reassure her, and I would reassure all of us with this idea, not everybody is going to be responsive to this. Not everybody followed Jesus, and a lot of those who did follow him later did not. As a matter of fact, all of them did not at one point in time. So you never can tell what effect any of this is going to have on anybody. What you want to do, though, is constantly be putting it out there for people to grab hold of and to engage in spiritual conversations. Okay, so that's what I hope we're going to be able to do. I had a great story told to me on Sunday. And I've got a microphone because I want to make sure everybody hears this. And I asked her, would she be willing to tell it tonight? And she said she would. So Jan Meek came up to me on Sunday, and it was very encouraging, which I appreciated. But more important than that, it was helpful, I think, just to hear, you know, how this can work out. So anyway, Jan.
Yes, Steve says I don't need this.
It's for the people at home.
I've never spoken in a room where I needed a microphone. And to answer your question, my first response would have been, then I need another doctor. But I don't know. I'm thinking right now, I'd say, well, do you mind if I pray for you?
That's
you know?
good. That's good.
So after last Wednesday night's class, which I think the question thing has not only been forefront in my mind about the discipleship thing, but just in other areas of life too. I know one night when we were talking about it, I thought, you know, I think it's something all parents need to know. And I had a chance to use that on one of my grandkids this week. They asked me a question, and I said, I don't know, what do you think? And it was, you know, it gave me the basis of how to answer the question. And also in marriage, I think that would be a good way to, if you just say, so what's really bothering you? I mean, obviously something is, what's really bothering you? And that way you can say it and get it over with. But anyway, I, on an average day, don't see many people to talk to about anything. And then after last Wednesday night's class, the thing I took away from it was that it helped me be more comfortable with the idea of asking questions. Hey, you know, if you ask a question, they can't really be offended if you're asking a question. And so my mom and dad's church, where my dad, where I grew up, the church where I grew up recently closed its doors. And my grandfather, my mom's dad, built the building. And then my dad devoted his whole life, you know, our whole life was wrapped up in the church as, you know, back in the 50s and 60s. So they closed the doors after my dad passed away. And they auctioned it off last Thursday. So I was in Lawrenceburg to take my mom to the auction. And we went to lunch before that, and there was an older lady that was the waitress. And I had seen her in there before, and so she came over to the, am I too loud? She came over to the table and took our order and was, you know, just chatting. And I said, do you own this place? And she said, goodness, no. The less time I spend here, the better off I am. But she ended up pulling her chair up to our table and just let the restaurant go, you know, let everybody else be waited on by somebody else. And when she left, when we finally left, she said, I prayed to God this morning that somebody would come in to listen to me And I said, that's my favorite thing to do, is to be an answer to somebody's prayer for God used me. So that was the first one. The second one was we went to the auction and we got there early. It was at 5 o'clock and we got there about 4:30 and we're, just sitting there. And as people came in, several of the people who had just come to the auction were former members at First Street. And so every time they'd say, oh, I used to go here, I would say, oh, really? I said, well, where do you attend now? And probably asked that to 5 or 6 people. And there was one guy that was, when we were teenagers, went to church there, and he said, oh, I don't go anywhere. And I stopped a minute, and I said, you know what, Tommy? I said, you need to be in church. And I said, it was different than being able to have a discussion with him. I just wanted him to know. I said, when life gets hard, your church is your family, and that's where you get your help. I said, you really need to be in church. And so I said, just think about it. And so then when the auction started, by way of my cousin, had him open it with a prayer. And because there were probably 50 people there, and I doubt that all of them were churched. All of them went to church. And so he did. He opened it with a prayer, and he said, one of the auctioneers said, one of the questions that I've been asked is what's going to happen to the money from the auction. And he said it's going to go to Church of Christ Missions. And so the auction was a little slow. They did it in 3 pieces, and it was a little slow getting started. So between the first piece and the second piece, I said, would you remind everybody that the money's going to missions? So anyway, the auction was very successful. I think people that were there, I didn't convert anybody, but I felt like everybody that I talked to hopefully had a positive feeling about the Church of Christ if they'd never been in a Church of Christ. And I hope when I said, oh, I'm glad you're going to so-and-so, if they hadn't been going regularly, I hope, that they took that as an encouragement to be more faithful. But anyway, I don't normally see 50 people to have a conversation with them, so it was just an unusual day for me.
Wonderful. Hang on, before you give that back, were you with Regina at that time at Barbara's? Were you in that? Do you know what I'm talking
so.
about? Is there anybody that was here at a dinner at Barbara's? Okay. I hope I'm telling this right. I'm going to try to retell. I thought maybe you were one of the people that were there. Regina was
it may jog my memory, but I don't know what you're talking about.
Regina was at Barbara's home cooking one time. And they were, it was a group of ladies. And I thought it was from Barry's Chapel. I could be wrong. It could have been a different group. But they were just, talking like you usually do, waiting for the meal. And the lady came up, and who was waiting on them, and she was obviously kind of, flustered and all. And so somebody in the group, I don't know who, it might have been Regina, but it might have been somebody else. I can't remember. I'm sorry. I don't know the details exactly. But somebody asked, is there something we could pray for you about? And she said, yeah, that would be great. And so she told a story about, reason why she was stressed. And so they offered a prayer. So she brings the meal. They're having a great meal. And then a little bit later, she walks up again, presumably just to serve them some more or whatever, checking on them. And she said, hey, there's a young man back in the back who's really having a hard time right now. And since y'all have prayed for me, would you mind if I brought him up here and y'all pray for him too? And they did. And it was a very touching story. I wish I could remember it, and I wish somebody here had been there, had been one of the people to make sure I'm getting this right. But it was questions that brought that to the forefront. Just asking a question. Can I pray for you about something? Where do you go to church? Or have you, been involved? Whatever it takes to get a spiritual conversation going is a great way to start that. And you often see that as Jesus interacted with people. Just ask a question that hopefully gets things going in the right direction. what we were able to get to last week when we were looking at questions was we looked at some questions that Jesus asked during this, what we know as the Sermon on the Mount, and we wound up spending a lot of time, which was great because that was the whole point anyway, talking about worry. Why do you worry? And can't you see the lilies of the field and the birds of the air and how God takes care of them? And so why is it that you feel like you have to worry? Because you're more valuable to God than birds and flowers. And so Jesus used questions as a teaching method all the time. So this week we're going to be in Mark chapter 8 to begin with. Mark chapter 8. I'm trying to get something out of each one of the Gospels as we go through here. We're not going to be able to cover it all. We don't have nearly enough time to cover all the Gospels, but we're going to hit some high points, what I hope are high points. Mark chapter 8. But before we do this, in Mark chapter 8, I ran across this video because I'm always looking at videos. I find them pretty helpful. And I ran across this one, and I thought, it's not just the answer to this question, which is a good one, and you've probably been asking. If you haven't, you probably will if you start many spiritual conversations. But it's the thought process that goes into strategically asking questions that I want to try to pick up on. So I thought this might be helpful. Steve, if you would.
In your conversations with other people about Christ and Christianity and the real important things, you are going to encounter what I call the question. That is the question that stops most Christians in their tracks, and they don't really quite know how to deal with it. And the question was posed to me in a hour-long TV debate that I had with Deepak Chopra, the New Age guru, as we talked about spiritual things. And what he said to me is, so you're saying that anyone who doesn't believe just like you is going to hell? That's the way he put the question. Now, some people have said if you're careful how you push the question, you could win any argument. And the problem here is that this was a question about the exclusivity of Christ, a critical issue in Christianity, but it was put in a way that made me look really, really bad. So if I would have answered the question, yes, unless you believe that Jesus is the Messiah, then you will die in your sins, you will go to hell, I would have answered correctly, but I would have really given the wrong impression. I would have fulfilled a really negative stereotype that people have of Christians, and I would have played right into Deepak Chopra's rhetorical hand, and I did not want to do that. And so in that particular circumstance, I sidestepped the issue and went in a different direction. But we can't always sidestep that issue, and nor should we. We need to address it because it's really, really important. But how do we do that? And this is where the tactical approach, I think, is really golden, especially using the Columbo tactic in its third sense, and that is using questions to make a point. Using questions allows us to make the point in a much more powerful way, especially when we get stuck in a circumstance like this, people asking us about Jesus being the only way of salvation. This happened to me once in a Barnes & Noble where I was giving a presentation for a book I'd written, the relativism book, and afterwards during the Q&A, someone came up to me and asked the question, why do I need to believe in Jesus? He said, I'm Jewish, I believe in God, I try to live the best life that I can. Why do I need Jesus? So there's the question again, not as belligerently put as with Deepak Chopra, but the question. Now, here's a case where I want to lead up to the point. I want to make the point by making a couple of steps. I have a choice at this point. I could go ahead and state my steps as part of my argument, put my pieces on the table, so to speak, and then come to a conclusion, which leaves me with a certain liability. Every time I make a claim that is a stepping stone to my conclusion, the other person, especially if they're a little bit belligerent, can just deny the claim. And now I get nowhere. So instead, I am going to use questions to get those pieces placed on the table by the other person. Because if they put those pieces on the table, it's a lot harder for them to take them off, to deny them, okay? Let me show you how that works with the question, all right? And this person who asked the question there at the Barnes & Noble. I said, when he offered the question, do you mind if I ask you a couple of questions? No, go right ahead. Here was the first question I asked. Do you think that people who commit moral crimes ought to be punished? In other words, do people who do bad things, should they pay for them? And he said, well, since I'm a prosecuting attorney, yeah, I got lucky on the attorney part, you know. But most people have this sense, this deep intuition that people who do wrong things should not get away with them, okay? And so I agreed with him. I agree that people who do wrong things ought to be punished. So now we've got a piece on the table. He put it there because I asked him the question. Second question, have you ever done any wrong things? That's personal, right? What do you think he said? He said, yeah, I guess I have. If he would said he didn't do any bad things, I want to talk to his wife, you know. No, of course not. We all know we've done wrong things. I agreed with him, so have I. And then I said, now we got another piece on the table. And so I said to him, look at where we come just in two questions. We both agree that people who do bad things ought to be punished, and we both agree that we've done those bad things. You know what I call that? I said to him. What? He said. I said, bad news. This is not a good picture for us. Now, do I need to tell this man he's a sinner? No. He just told me. Do I need to tell him that he's under judgment? No. He just told me. Now, he wasn't thinking about that when he walked into the Barnes & Noble. But when I asked him a couple of simple questions that brought these moral intuitions, moral common sense really, to his awareness, he laid them right on the table. Now I've got something to work with. And then I went from there and I explained, it's as if the judge is about to lower the gavel on the two of us in the dock, and we both know we're guilty, and we both know we deserve what we're going to get. And then the judge pauses and says, by the way, are either of you guys interested in a pardon at this point? Look, when you know you're guilty, you're much more open to an offer of forgiveness. And that's exactly where I wanted to bring him. And then I explained in very simple terms about substitutionary atonement, that the judge took off his robe and got in the dock and took the punishment for us so that we could be set free. I didn't use the language of substitution, I just explained it, because that's what God has done in Jesus. And that's why Jesus is the only way. He's the only one who solved the problem. Nobody else could do this. Only Jesus could. And that's why we have to put our confidence in him. So what I've done now is I've taken a very tricky situation, the question, and I've approached it using a tactical approach, getting help from the other person to get my pieces on the table, so that when I'm going to make my case, now it's much easier to do so in light of what he's helped me to establish. And I don't know if that attorney trusted the Lord or not, but at least I was communicating the gospel to him at least in a way that he could understand, because now it just wasn't a matter of believing in God and living the best way you could live. We both realize that's not enough. If we're really guilty, then there's got to be a solution to the guilt problem. And that's what Christians offer in Christ. God becoming a man to take the guilt upon himself so that we can be forgiven. That's the reason Jesus is the only way. He's the only one who solved the problem. And this is one way of getting to that vital point, by using a tactical approach.
Okay, I thought that might be kind of helpful. Does anybody remember the old Columbo show? Did you ever watch that? Yeah, he was a pretty interesting guy, the way he asked questions and brought things out. And, you know, he practically had them convicted before they were even arrested. You know, I mean, he was remarkable at that. And I have heard somebody
some people he work miracles with, don't tell people. But I think in all this, he was directed, because he would offer himself at the Passover at the right time, and you gotta control the message.
I think you're onto something here, and I agree with you. This is not any kind of rebuttal, so don't take it that way. But I also think a lot of times we have to be sensitive to, is this the right time for this conversation? So yes, you recognize it, and what you recognize is true, but people around may not be ready for that. It's okay for you to know, but later. And so as people see events unfolding, you know, it became time later. Tell everybody. You know, once I have demonstrated that it really is me, then you can tell everybody, right? And how did he do that? How did he demonstrate? I am the Christ. I am the Messiah. Aha, but he didn't stay dead. Resurrection was the proof. And once the proof was out there, you kill me, you know you kill me, but I'm still here. Then it was time, right? So there's a timing thing. We have to be sensitive to that too, in my opinion. I think we need to realize that sometimes it's too early to jump into, hey, I know where there's baptistry, you ready? Hang on. Remember what Jesus' marching orders were. Go and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son. So why would you try to get somebody baptized before they're a disciple? Is that a good question? Is that a bad question?
You'll get them.
Yes.
Well, the baptism is that sign of that choice. It's an outward commitment of an inward change.
Mm-hmm. Yes, people were following Jesus. And as you saw in the video, sometimes people have to be convinced, I really do need this, right? And if they don't think they need it, they're not going to be responsive to it. So think about the timing of what we're doing too as we interact and we're trying to disciple people. What we want to do is try to make sure that we're taking them down a discipleship path. Just getting somebody to the baptistry is not the objective. Making disciples of Christ is the objective, and baptism will happen. Remember Randy Stevens? I will never forget his sermon where he made that point. I think he's exactly right. If you make a disciple, you can't stop them from being baptized. And in one of our earlier classes, one of the things that we looked at was Jesus insisted on being baptized himself. When somebody is ready, you say, you're going to follow Jesus. Look what Jesus did. He didn't need to do it to get his sins washed away like Paul did. Jesus did it because it's the right thing to do. And if you're a disciple of Christ and you're trying to follow Jesus, baptism is automatic. You don't have to have that conversation anymore. Right? Does that make sense to anybody? If I'm off track, you need to reel me back in.
You know, it's according to the person, because a lot of people were ready very quick.
Yes.
Quickly. Day of Pentecost, the Ethiopian eunuch on his way back home, is according to where they are. It might be immediate, it might take a year.
Yep, exactly. So we need to be thinking about our timing as well. Jesus was always conscious of timing, and this wasn't the time, but he wanted to make sure that they knew who he was. And once Peter answered for the disciples that were around him there, then, okay, yes, but hold off. People aren't ready to hear this. Okay.
Right about that on the timing, because it also, when you asked that question, it made me think, you know, he gave things a lot of times in parables and in pieces. Even though they knew he was the Messiah, they didn't really completely understand the mission until it was completed. Like right before, you know, oh, we get it, you know. So you're right, it's laid out in pieces for them. His timing is perfect, but yeah, I was just, when he said you're the Messiah, I was just thinking too, because even after that, they have all these questions and all these things, so it is a timing situation.
Mhm.
They didn't
next thing Jesus says here would certainly open their minds to, wow, we don't know what all this means.
Yeah.
Because now he's going to say, I'm going to die, the priests are
Yeah,
going to
yeah,
be
yeah.
involved.
You get ahead of it. Yeah, I'm going to read that
Oh,
next.
I'm sorry.
No. Nothing to be sorry about, because that's really exactly where I'm going. Because once they recognized, yes, you're the Messiah, he knew that they still had a wrong impression, right? Because he knows they're thinking, Messiah, deliverer, king, and later on they're asking him, can we sit on your right and on your left and all that kind of stuff. So they're still thinking completely differently than what Jesus is trying to teach. So this next section, he is introducing them to, hey, this is not what you think it is. Okay, let's go ahead and read that. I'm in verse 31. Okay, this is Mark chapter 8, verse 31. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it." Here comes the questions now. Look how strategic this is. What good is it for a man to gain the whole world yet forfeit his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. Okay, have you ever wondered, would Peter have been offended? "Get behind me, Satan." He probably was.
Well, you're going to do good by you, and you talk to them about it.
Yeah, he's trying to say, look, you need to be positive here, okay? This whole thing about you're going to die and, be spit on and all that kind of stuff. What are you talking about? You're the Messiah. I just told you who you are.
You're the king, and I want to seek by you.
Exactly. So it's clear he's thinking wrong. And Jesus is trying to get his attention, and he's trying to get the attention of everybody. And we've talked about this in the past. There's a cost to being a disciple of Jesus. What would you say the cost is?
Could be your life.
Could be your life. Sure could. Anything else?
You make a decision, you won't live, but he'll live in me.
Go where Jesus went with this question. What would you give in exchange for your soul? I want you to think real careful about that for just a second. Let's just say that you've lived the most awesomest life you can possibly imagine. You've had everything you've ever wanted. Everything has gone your way. You're wealthy. You've enjoyed traveling the world. You've got anything and everything you want exactly when you want it. Picture your life that way for just a second. And yet, when you know you're about to die, and you know that you don't have eternal life, what would you give for it in that moment? Everything, without question, without hesitation, wouldn't you? So Jesus is trying to say, look, take a cross. What would that have meant to them? Taking up a cross. How did they picture a cross? To us, it's beautiful jewelry. What was it to them?
Every piece of wood.
Yeah, it represented
A big
death.
load is what they're carrying.
It was torture. So you're telling me that I've got to be crucified if I'm going to be a disciple. Now, how do you think that message is going to go over?
Because it wasn't just dying, it was dying in a very painful way, one of the scariest ways to die, a way that everybody saw and knew
myself is to give up what I want,
Painful and shameful.
which is a great thing. I want my stuff to give.
But do you do things to save your life?
Do I need?
Do you do things to save your life?
Sure.
Of course you do. You eat, don't you?
Yeah. Yeah. Breathe.
Yeah, of course. Everybody, we eat. Some of us do more of that than others. We exercise, and some of us do less than that than the others. But we still do things to save our life. We take our medicine. We try to avoid dangerous situations. We do all these things to try to save our life. But Jesus is trying to make a really, really important point that all of us need to remember. And he's making it in the context of, look, here's what I can offer. I can offer eternal life. We don't have to worry about this stuff anymore. But you've got to deny yourself. Because if you'll do that, if you give up your life for me, that's how you save it. It seems like such a strange message, but we should know, we of all people should know, it's the best message of all. By giving up my life, what I want and what I jealously desire, for what Jesus wants in my life, makes all the difference. And besides, you're going to lose your life anyway. No matter how much medicine you take, how much exercise you get, how correctly you eat, how many dangerous situations you stay out of. I'm sorry to tell you, in case you didn't know, you're going to die. So you're not always going to be able to save your life. And why don't you live in that why don't all of us, not just you, but all of us, need to live in that final moment, knowing that, you know what, if I give up my life to be a disciple, I've actually saved my life. And remember, one of the very first weeks, I can't remember whether it was week 1 or week 2, one thing we looked at was Jesus came to give life and give it to the full. Remember that? That's Luke 10, in case you look it up. He wanted us to understand what a full life looks like. It's not how big a house, big a car, valued 401k, blah, 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 all that stuff that we so often give our lives to. It's a full life knowing that we're serving him by serving others. Remember, that was his whole message. If you give a cup of cold water to somebody in my name, you did it for me. If you go to see somebody who's sick or in prison, that's me. So every time we're doing that, we're giving up our time, putting out our effort to do those things. You may look at it and say, hey, that's Red Berry. No, it's really Jesus. Do you ever think yourself as Jesus? Well, you are. Well, you are. But that's the point. If somebody treats your child good, don't you like them? I do. I like people who treat my children good. Don't you think God thinks the same thing? So he's trying to help us understand the way to really have life is to give yours up in service to others. That's the whole teaching here. When we can do that, that's where those opportunities come from. Tom is going to do a follow-on class to this one, Discipleship in the Epistles, and I have no idea what he's going to do with it. We've talked a little bit, but I didn't try to tell him how to do his class because he didn't try to tell me how to do mine. So I'm going to let him do it however he wants to. But I want you to think about what made the difference based on what we know about Acts. They had no Bible. The only preacher they knew about that was any good was Peter. And yet, the gospel in the first century spread like wildfire. How could that have happened? I mean, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? Oh, yeah, was the message. And let me show you what that looks like.
Persecution.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Persecution was everywhere. That cross followed them, in many cases, literally. So, the last thing I want to do is try to guilt trip anybody into anything. okay? No guilt here, okay? I wish I could motivate all of us, starting with me, to be better at this, to be better at, let's get the gospel out there, because my life is already full. I feel blessed. I have an eternal home. I do have everything, okay? And it's not because I'm smart or good or just blessed, but it's because I really trust Jesus, and I really do try to do like him as best I can. Mess it up a lot. I've got heartaches and troubles like everybody does. I've been broke before. I've been real broke before. But I'm just telling you, following Jesus makes a completely different life than what everybody else experiences. And they see that in us. They saw it in the first century. They saw what disciples of Christ looked like, and they couldn't get enough of it. Yeah, I want to be a part of that. I think we can do that again.
You know, I do think that in the context of whether you're a Roman or whether you were a Jew, you had something. But the rest of the world was just enslaved to Rome. And that's where the bulk of Christianity came from. And so I think it's more difficult when you're living in times like we are, where we feel like we got our rights and nobody can take anything from, you know, I mean, we just all feel that way. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but we don't feel as lost as the world would have felt enslaved by Rome and persecuted by Jerusalem. But the gospel still needs to be spread, and we need to know ways to do it. Yeah. But just like Honduras or Cuba, you know, we've heard about here, people are more responsive because it's not like they have much to. A human being knows they're going to die. That's what makes us the difference from all the other living things. Yeah. And it makes you think more about it when you can't do much about something on this earth.
Mm-hmm. One thing I've observed, and you all feel free to correct me, but in many, many cases, the richer somebody gets, the less they feel like they need God. Has anybody else observed that? That's generally true. It's a generalization, for sure.
It's the truth.
But yes, it is true. Jesus acknowledged it as the truth because he said it's hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. It's hard. Why is it hard? Because they think they've got anything and they don't need anything. The beauty of that video was he helped a prosecuting attorney. Have you ever seen a prosecuting attorney that was broke? I never have. There may be some out there, but I've never met them. They have been some of my best clients too, by the way. So I'm just telling you, most of the time, someone who is wealthy feels like they don't need anything. But what did that line of questioning do? Yeah, I do need something because I'm guilty. And if I can't get rid of this guilt any other way, but Jesus, maybe I better check this out. Now, who knows what happened to him? You know, he may have gone off and been drunk before the sun went down. Who knows? But, what if he's still thinking about that encounter? Or what if he acted on what he learned in that encounter? Yeah.
I'll tell one story.
Yeah, sure.
My mother, we went to church, you know, and my dad didn't go with us. But anyway, I followed the way of my dad. My brother and I did more. Although we went to church with mother, we weren't living like mother. My sister was like mother. But anyway, my dad died in high school. I was still, you know, I respected my mother. I always did perfect around her. I wasn't living that way. And I went to college, and I certainly wasn't living that way. And I was working a book rush one time, and I worked in a bookstore, and that was before self-service and Amazon, and lines would get real long of these students waiting and waiting to get their books. And it could take a long, long time to get there. And one lady that I'd known from Birmingham, and she was there at Auburn as a student. And I saw her back there, and she was in the back of the line, and well, I didn't see her right away, but she had been there a long time to get that, waited in line, got to the book place and asked me, said, Tommy, I'm Carolyn, you know, and I remember, she said, I would just like for you to know that we're having some services here. We'd love for you to come. We're having somebody that preaches that you know. And you know, I didn't go. But I really believe that put something in me that never left me. And it's just that somebody went really out of the way to just ask me, would I come? And you never know. And I think her doing that had a big influence on how I ended up thinking when I started to get married.
It's that mustard seed thing. That's the principle Jesus was trying to teach. If you could just get that tiny little seed in there, you just never know what might grow from it. And you're a perfect example of that. So that should be an encouragement to all of us. Let's plant those little seeds. Just even the little ones, they make a difference. Okay? I've got 5 minutes left and about 3 hours of material. So I don't think I want to do that. So I guess we're going to need to continue this because I was going to go on over into Luke, and there's a really good thing there to wind this up. But hopefully we haven't wasted any of this time. Hopefully we have seen the value of these questions and the way Jesus strategically asks questions to help people realize the value of what we as disciples of Jesus actually have. It's priceless. And that should motivate us to want to try to give that to other people as much as we can. If you've got good news, do you try to tell people about it? Of course you do. And you've got the best news on the planet. I've got the best news on the planet, so I need to be aware of it.
Grandchildren. You don't have to ask a good golfer about his love of golf, or a fisherman of a fisherman, or a hunter about hunting. It's what's most bubbling up inside of you that you can't contain.
Yep. Let's try to make sure it's this. Okay. Any other comments, questions? As opposed to going on over into the other, I'm going to save that 3 hours of stuff for next week. I'll have to condense it then too. So, but anyway, as we finish up tonight, Steve, I'm going to ask you if you don't mind to pray us out. All right. Thanks. Yo.
So the books for Sunday morning are back here in this box. If you're going to be in the 8:30 class on Sunday morning, pick up a book, and we will be looking. You will need to read the first 16 pages of this book in preparation for Sunday morning.
Perfect. It's an easy read. Even I did it. Okay, great. Thank you. I was about to forget that. Oh, and if you would, just remember all the folks at camp, because there's some people that would have been here and did not make for camp tonight.
Father God, we're thankful for the day you've given us. Father, we're thankful that we're able to get together tonight to study your word, study your gospel, study your son. We pray that we'll use these questions, put them to use next tomorrow, the next few days, to start conversations with people about Jesus. Father, we pray we'll do that. Pray you put it on our hearts. Just give us the opportunities and help us have the courage and just realize that these questions are showing we care about other people and showing we care about Jesus. Help us to match those two things up in a way that other people will see Jesus in our lives. Pray be with those at camp. Give them safety. Give them a good week of togetherness and learning to value each other, and help us to just encourage that group as they come back. And just thankful for all the people that are there working at that camp and all the kids that are there. Pray you bless their week there. Be with those that are struggling with health issues.